Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day.
Today we'll explore the moment when CEO James chose people over profit, rewarding 120 workers before Tet, and returning to a simple life with Tu Diep. What happens when success no longer feels heavy, and love is no longer spoken in promises but in everyday choices? Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and don't miss the next story about healing, love, and what truly matters. As the Lunar New Year slowly approached, the wooden factory entered its most intense, yet emotionally charged time of the year. The machines ran almost without rest, their steady rhythm echoing through the wide space filled with the scent of fresh-cut wood. Workers moved back and forth with practiced efficiency, hands familiar with every tool, every motion, every sound. There was fatigue in their bodies, visible in the way shoulders slumped and steps slowed, yet beneath that exhaustion lived a quiet excitement that no amount of work could fully suppress. Tet was coming, home was calling. Each plank completed, each order finished, brought them one step closer to reunion, rest, and warmth. The atmosphere carried both weariness and hope, intertwined so naturally that no one bothered to separate them. James arrived without ceremony. There was no announcement, no gathering, no authoritative presence demanding attention. He did not walk through the factory as a CEO inspecting performance. Instead, he stood quietly at a distance, blending into the background like an observer rather than a commander. His hands rested in his pockets, his posture relaxed, his eyes attentive. He watched the workers one by one, not as numbers or productivity units, but as individuals moving through their final stretch of the year. There was something grounding about standing there unnoticed, hearing the real sound of labor rather than reports or summaries. As he continued to observe, details began to surface that spreadsheets could never capture. He noticed hands roughened by years of handling wood, fingers marked by small cuts that had long since stopped drawing sympathy. Sweat darkened the backs of worn shirts, clinging stubbornly despite the cooler end-of-year air. Some workers were older, their movements slower but more deliberate, carrying years of experience in every measured step. They did not complain. They rarely paused. They worked with a quiet determination that came not from ambition, but from responsibility. In that moment, James felt the invisible distance between his title and their reality dissolve slightly, replaced by something more honest. Later, inside a modest office, tucked away from the noise, James sat alone with a single sheet of paper in front of him. A list, 120 names. 120 lives tied in some way to this factory. He read each name carefully, his eyes moving slower than usual, lingering on dates, durations, notes scribbled beside certain entries. 2 years, 3 years, a few months. Each line represented time spent, effort given, moments sacrificed. This was no longer an abstract workforce. It was a collective of people who had given parts of their lives to the same place. James picked up a pen and began marking the list deliberately. He separated long-term workers from newer ones, noting seniority with precision. He refused to allow shortcuts, refused the idea of rounding things off for convenience. To him, fairness was not about equality in numbers, but recognition in context. Each mark was an acknowledgement that time mattered, that loyalty mattered, that effort left traces worth honoring. The process demanded focus, but it also brought clarity. As he worked, his thoughts drifted toward the meaning of the Lunar New Year itself. Not the decorations, not the formal greetings, but the essence of it. Tet was about returning home, returning to family, returning to roots that existed long before careers and responsibilities took shape. He thought of parents waiting patiently, of children counting days, of homes preparing for reunion with whatever means they had. In Vietnamese culture, Tet was not optional. It was emotional, spiritual, deeply human, and suddenly the idea of a year-end bonus was no longer just policy. It was part of something much larger, Uninvited images formed in his mind. Workers boarding crowded buses with envelopes tucked carefully into their bags. Mothers buying new clothes for their children. Fathers carrying gifts home with tired but satisfied smiles. Simple joys made possible not by luxury but by reassurance. James felt a subtle tightening in his chest. He realized how fragile that reassurance could be, how easily it could be taken away by indifference or miscalculation. He leaned back in his chair and asked himself a question that lingered longer than expected. If a man could build a business, earn success, command respect, yet leave the people who built that success anxious about returning home, then what was the true value of that achievement? The question did not accuse him, it invited him to grow. The decision followed naturally. James chose to reward all 120 workers without exception. No exclusions, no selective generosity. Everyone who had contributed would be acknowledged. The clarity of the choice surprised even him. It felt less like generosity and more like alignment, as though something had finally clicked into place. He instructed the management team to distribute the bonuses transparently, according to seniority and contribution, with clear records for each individual. There would be no ambiguity, no vague explanations, no hidden conditions. He insisted the payments be made well before the holiday, giving everyone time to prepare, to plan, to breathe. Practical kindness mattered more than symbolic gestures. When discussing the matter, James was firm about one thing. This was not charity, it was recognition. Not a favor granted from above, but respect extended horizontally. He asked that there be no formal ceremonies, no public praise attached to his name. Gratitude did not need an audience. Meaning did not need applause. The news spread quickly through the factory. Reactions varied. Some workers smiled openly, relief written plainly across their faces. Others nodded quietly, eyes softening as weight lifted silently from their shoulders. There were no dramatic scenes, no loud celebrations, just a collective easing of tension, a shared sense that things would be okay. James watched from afar once more. He did not step into the center of that moment. He did not need to. Observing was enough. He felt lighter, not because of praise, but because something felt right. As the day ended, James left the factory while the sky darkened slowly above him. The usual mental weight he carried as a CEO did not follow him out the gate. Instead, there was a sense of release, as though he had set something down without realizing he had been carrying it for so long. He returned not to a mansion, not to a symbol of success, but to a small wooden house nestled within a bamboo forest. Here, titles lost meaning. Here, he was simply James. Inside, Tu Diep was preparing dinner. Nothing elaborate, just familiar dishes made with care. The kitchen smelled warm, inviting. She moved with ease, her presence grounding, her actions unhurried. This was not performance. This was life. They ate together quietly. There were no grand conversations, no discussions of strategy or growth, just simple questions. Was he tired? Did the food taste good? Small exchanges that carried more comfort than any celebration. James spoke about the bonuses as one might share an ordinary thought. No pride, no emphasis, just an account of something done. Tu Diep listened attentively, not interrupting, not praising excessively. When she spoke, she simply said that the workers would now have a peaceful tete. That was all. In that moment, James understood something he had been circling for a long time. Happiness did not come from control or expansion. It came from alignment, from knowing that one's actions eased rather than burdened others, from returning to a life that felt human again. He looked around the small house, at the quiet forest beyond, at the woman sitting across from him, and felt a gentle realization settle in. Life did not need to be loud to be meaningful. It only needed to be honest and present and shared. And as the evening stretched forward without urgency, James felt himself standing at the edge of something calmer, something truer, something he was finally ready to step into without rushing, without fear, without the need to arrive anywhere else just yet. Life truly began to feel lighter, but not in the way James once imagined. It was not the kind of lightness that came from escaping responsibility, nor the relief of handing burdens to someone else. It was the quiet kind of lightness that arrived when a person finally stopped arguing with their own life. James noticed it in small, almost embarrassing ways. He no longer checked his phone the moment he woke up. He found himself lingering over breakfast, even when there was nowhere urgent to be. He caught himself smiling at ordinary things, like the sound of water boiling or the way steam rose from a simple bowl of soup. Things that once felt like distractions now felt like anchors. He realized that the pace of his days had slowed, not because his life had become smaller, but because it had become clearer. There were fewer voices competing in his head, fewer questions about what he should become next, and fewer fears about falling behind. For years, he had believed that pressure was proof of importance, that exhaustion was the price of relevance, that rest was something earned only after success was complete. But now, sitting in this life he once would have dismissed as too ordinary, James understood something almost funny in its simplicity. The pressure had not been necessary. The race had mostly existed in his own mind, and the version of success he chased so relentlessly had never asked whether he was happy carrying it. This life, slower and quieter, did not applaud him. It did not flatter him. It did not demand anything from him. And somehow, that made it feel profoundly meaningful. That evening, as the sky gradually dimmed, James and Tu Diep found themselves sitting side by side on the wooden porch of the small house. There was no ceremony to it, no announcement that this moment mattered. They simply ended up there, as people often do when they feel at home. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath their weight. The air carried the faint scent of bamboo and the warmth of a day that had been lived without urgency. James leaned back slightly, stretching his legs, letting his body sink into the stillness. Tu Diep sat beside him, her presence steady, unintrusive, familiar in the most comforting way. They did not talk much. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing they needed to explain. For a long time, James had mistaken silence for distance. He believed that quiet meant something was missing. But now, he understood that silence could also mean safety. It could mean that two people trusted the moment enough not to fill it with noise. There was something unexpectedly romantic about this kind of quiet, not the romance of grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but the romance of choosing not to perform, of allowing love to exist without an audience. James glanced at Tu Diep, his gaze lingering a little longer than usual. He noticed details he had seen countless times before, yet somehow understood differently now. The calm patience in her expression, the way she seemed fully present, not waiting for something better to happen, the way she occupied space without demanding control over it. And in that observation, something inside James settled with surprising certainty. She was not a phase in his life. She was not a reward he had earned. She was the place his heart returned to when everything else fell quiet. He thought back to all the moments when ambition had pulled him away, when work demanded more than he thought he had to give, when success insisted that personal life be postponed, and he realized that through all of it, she had never tried to compete with his world. She had simply remained steady, available. Real. That realization carried more weight than any declaration he could make. After a while, James spoke, his voice unhurried, almost casual, as if he were sharing a passing thought. He admitted that for most of his life, he had believed love needed to be impressive, that it should come with plans, promises, and visible proof. He joked lightly that he used to think love was something you could put into a presentation and explain to others. He said that he once believed saying, "I love you," meant outlining a future so convincingly that no one could doubt it. But somewhere along the way, his understanding had shifted. He told her that love, to him now, felt less like a promise about tomorrow and more like a choice made repeatedly today. He said that he no longer trusted grand words as much as he trusted consistency, that showing up mattered more than saying the right thing, that staying mattered more than swearing forever. With a hint of humor, he confessed that he would probably never be very good at romance in the cinematic sense, that he might forget small details, that he would sometimes retreat into silence when overwhelmed. But he said that none of that frightened him anymore because he knew what he was choosing. And he knew why he turned toward her fully then, not dramatically, not urgently, but with the calm assurance of someone who had already made peace with himself. He looked at her and said the words without raising his voice, without decorating them with emotion. "I don't love you just today," he said. "I love you every day." The sentence did not echo, it did not demand a reaction. It simply existed between them, steady and unshaken. Tu Diep did not respond with tears or excitement. She did not need to. She reached for his hand and held it, her grip gentle but certain. There was no hesitation in her touch, no question, just acceptance. In that moment, James felt something he had not realized he was missing. A sense of being understood without explanation, a sense of being chosen without conditions. Outside the house, the signs of the approaching Lunar New Year quietly gathered. The world seemed to soften. People moved a little slower, voices carried more warmth. Even the air felt different, as if time itself was easing its grip. James thought about the workers preparing to return home, about families counting days, not deadlines, about the way life, at least once a year, collectively agreed to pause. He realized that this pause was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and for the first time, he allowed himself to be part of it. Sitting there, holding Tu Diep's hand, James understood something that years of achievement had never taught him. That success was not about standing higher than others. It was about standing where you could breathe, where you could love without calculation, where you could live without constantly proving your worth. As the night settled deeper and the quiet grew more intimate, James felt no urge to rush forward, no desire to chase the next milestone. This moment, simple and unremarkable to anyone else, felt complete. And in that completeness, he found a kind of happiness that did not fade when the lights went out. A happiness that did not depend on applause. A happiness that asked only to be lived, one ordinary, meaningful day at a time. As Lunar New Year approaches, CEO James quietly observes his wooden workshop, witnessing the exhaustion and hope of 120 workers preparing for Tet. Reading each name and seniority, he reflects on Vietnamese traditions of family, return, and responsibility. James decides to give fair and early Tet bonuses to every worker, not as charity, but as recognition. Watching their silent relief, he feels lighter than any success he once chased. Leaving the workshop, James returns to a simple wooden house in the bamboo forest where life slows down with Tu Diep. Over modest meals and quiet conversations, he realizes happiness no longer comes from power, but from meaning. As Tet draws closer, their love grows in calm, unspoken moments. James chooses love not through grand promises, but through daily presence. In the end, he understands true success is living honestly and loving the right person.